This is the podcast, Funky Friday, hosted by Cam Newton. He's been scoring touchdowns in the NFL for years and is beloved by the culture. He has now transitioned into media. This is the Auditor, Chris Creary, host of I Made a Podcast, Faith Fact Podcast, and Podcast Production Labs. He's looking into this podcast to understand why it's been so successful and what he can learn from it. What you're about to hear is real. The podcasts are not clients, at least not yet. These are real shows created by real hosts being put under the microscope. Each episode, one podcast steps in, gets fully broken down, evaluated, and challenged across content, structure, and growth. No guessing, no sugarcoating, just honest insight on what's working, what's not, and what it's going to take to level up. This is where podcasts get better or get exposed. Welcome to the podcast Audit.
All right, so this is the first episode of the podcast Audit. I'm trying out something new for season number 4. Now, in the podcast Audit, I have a list of criteria that I take and I rate a podcast based on that criteria. And I'm going to give my summary in this episode. If you want the complete audit with all of the questions that I asked and the rating that I gave this podcast, there's a link in the description that you can click on, and then I will send it out to you so you can see the complete questions, every single question. I'm just going to give a summary of the 8 milestones in this audit so that you can see where I'm coming from, where this podcast gets it right, and the things that they can do to get it better. But with that being said, let's get into this episode right now. All right, so here's something I've been thinking about lately. Cam Newton has a podcast. And if you've been watching even one episode of Funky Friday, you already know it works. People are showing up, clips are spreading, and the culture is paying attention. But I want to go deeper than just saying, yeah, it's doing well. Because there's a difference between a podcast that gets views and downloads and a podcast that actually builds something lasting. And I think Funky Friday sits right in the middle of those two things, which honestly makes it one of the most interesting shows to study right now. So today we're going to do exactly that. We're going to talk about what makes it click. And then, more importantly, we're going to look at where it's leaving real growth on the table. So let's get into the podcast audit. So part number 1 is why Cam Newton works as a host. Okay, so let's start with the obvious. Cam Newton is not your typical podcaster. He didn't come from, through traditional media. He didn't grind through hundreds of episodes that nobody listened to. He walked into it with 2 decades of cultural weight behind him already. And that changes everything. When Cam Newton talks, there's a whole history of who he is that's already in the room. The touchdowns, the press conferences, the fashion, the controversies, the comebacks. You're not just hearing a guy share his opinion, you're hearing Cam Newton share his opinion. And that distinction matters enormously. This is what media people call personality first shows. The content exists to give the personality a platform, not the other way around. And when it works well, it really works well. So listeners feel like they're getting access to someone, not just information. The warmth comes through too. He's not performing, he's talking. The way he talks to people who he actually knows. And that kind of authenticity is genuinely hard to manufacture. A lot of podcasters spend years trying to sound that natural, and Cam just does it. So the key takeaway for us is a strong personal brand can instantly elevate a podcast. When the host is the draw, the content becomes a vehicle for connection and not just information. So part number 2 of this audit is the emotional engine behind the show. So here's something I find really fascinating about Funky Friday. It consistently makes people feel something. And I don't just mean it makes them feel inspired, but I mean the entire show. Sometimes you agree with him and sometimes you feel all fired up. Sometimes you push back in your head. And sometimes something he says may just sit with you for the rest of the day. That emotional range is actually the show's biggest engine because we share things we feel, not things we just think about. When a clip makes you go, okay, wait, he's right. Or it may make you say, I can't believe he just said that. You send it to someone else, you post it, you talk about it. And that's how the show keeps spreading beyond its existing audience. The conversations feel real because they are real, unfiltered, unscripted, sometimes unpolished, and that's part of the appeal. It doesn't feel like content, it feels like a conversation that you just happen to have sit in on. And the key takeaway here for us is emotion drives shareability. People spread content that makes them feel something, not just makes them think something. So, as you're creating your content, see how you can drive emotion into whatever it is that you're talking about. So, part number 3 is who this show is really for. One thing that this show does really brilliantly, actually, is know exactly who it's speaking to. Funky Friday lives at the very intersection of sports, masculinity, success, and Black culture. And it doesn't try to water that down or make it more palatable for a broader crowd. It just is what it is. And because of that, the people it's made for feel genuinely seen. And that is powerful. There is a huge difference between content that is made for everyone and content that feels like it was made for you. One of those builds loyal listeners and the other builds casual scrollers. So Cam's audience shows up with genuine investment because the show reflects something real about their world. That kind of connection is worth more than a large number or millions of downloads in your analytics. All right, so connection. The key takeaway for us here is specificity builds loyalty. Content that clearly speaks to a defined audience creates deeper connection than trying to appeal to everyone. All right, so keep that in mind. This one is very important. So part number 4 of the audit is the production side. So let's take a second to appreciate the presentation because it matters more than people want to give it credit for. The show looks good. It sounds clean. The branding is sharp. Everything about the visual and audio experience signals that this is a serious operation, and that signal reaches the listeners before a single word is even spoken. We make judgments about quality real quick. If something looks good and looks well put together, we assume that the content is as well. And it's not entirely fair, but it's real. And Funky Friday clears that bar easily. The production matches the brand, and the brand commands the attention. So the key takeaway from this point is perceived quality matters. Strong visual and audio signals professionalism and shape how the content is received before it even begins. Now, part number 5 is where the show could really go further, and it's the structure. Okay, so here's where we get into the honest part of this conversation. I know I've been saying a lot of things so far, and it's been all good. But this is where I feel like there is a lot of growth with this podcast because while the show has a lot going for it, there are some real gaps. And the first one is structure. Most episodes have strong opening energy. Then the conversation goes where it goes. And eventually things wind down, which can be fun to listen to, but it doesn't give the listener a clear journey. Great podcast episodes have a shape. There's a reason you're here, a direction, things are building towards something, a moment in the end where everything comes together. And without that, even loyal listeners can start to drift off. Not because they don't care, but because nothing is pulling them forward. A little more intentionality with the structure, not to be rigid, but just purposeful, would make each episode feel more complete, and it would make listeners more likely to come back for the next one. So the key takeaway here is without clear structure, engaging conversations can lose their momentum. Episodes need direction and a sense of progression to retain listeners. So the next part of the podcast audit is part number 6, which is the audience ownership gap. Now, Funky Friday generates a lot of attention, but right now, most of that attention lives on social platforms, which means the algorithms decide who sees it, and platforms control the reach. And if something changes tomorrow, the show has very little to fall back on. There's no strong call to action pulling listeners into an owned space. No email lists, no community hub, no clear next steps. And that's a real missed opportunity, in my opinion. Because the people watching and sharing this show are genuinely engaged, they just aren't being invited anywhere. When you own your audience, meaning you have a way to reach them directly outside of any social media platform, you have a lot of leverage. Right now, the show is building on rented ground because, again, most of the traction and the attention where people are going is on those social media platforms. So the key takeaway here for us is if you don't own your audience, you don't control your growth. So relying only on social platforms leaves your brand vulnerable. All right, so this is a very important one. Now, part number seven, of the audit is discoverability beyond the fan base. So here's something most listeners never think about, but it shapes how podcasts grow over time. Search, titles, descriptions, keywords, the stuff that lets someone who's never heard of the show stumble across it while looking for something else. Funky Friday grows mostly through existing fans and viral clips, which is great, but it's just one lane. And there's a whole other lane of organic discovery that shows that the show isn't really tapping into. A few intentional changes to how episodes are titled and described could meaningfully expand who finds the show and when they find it. So the key takeaway for us is growth isn't just viral, it's searchable. Optimizing titles and descriptions unlocks a whole new stream of listeners. So part number 8 of the podcast audit for Cam Newton's podcast is the difference between an audience and a community. So this is the last thing, and this one's more of a big picture thought. Okay, so Funky Friday has an audience. What it doesn't yet have is a community. And the difference is significant. An audience shows up when something is in front of them. A community seeks things out, talks to each other, and stays plugged in even between episodes. Now, building on that kind of community takes intentionality, a place for people to gather, ways to participate, reasons to stay connected between episodes. It's more work, but it's also something that turns a popular show into something that lasts the test of time. So the key takeaway here for us is that an audience consumes, but a community engages and stays. Long-term success comes from building connection beyond the content. So here's where we land on Funky Friday. It's genuinely a good show, and Cam Newton is a compelling host. The conversations are real, the production is strong, and it speaks to a specific audience in a way that actually resonates with them. And this is actually great. But it's operating like a brand-driven show, not a fully realized growth system. And the gap between those two things is where the biggest opportunities live: structure, audience ownership, community, discoverability. So here's what I want you to take away from this episode. You don't need Cam Newton's platform to apply these lessons. In fact, if you're building something smaller, getting the strategy right from the beginning is exactly how you punch above your weight class. Personality opens the door, strategy keeps it open. So thanks for listening today. If this got you thinking, share it with someone else who's building their own show, or just someone who loves breaking down what makes things work. Remember, the best time for you to start a podcast was 10 years ago. The second best time is right now. So go ahead and make it happen. And you'll hear from me again next week on I Made a Podcast. Peace.